True crime, Tamika Chesser and Julian's story, the Port Lincoln fire, and the walking trail. The fire, the footage, and the search for answers. The first visible sign was smoke. Not a confession. Not a verdict. Not a neat explanation. Just smoke at a unit on Flinders Highway in Port Lincoln. The kind of small emergency that can look containable from the outside. A neighbor noticed it. A door was entered. Water was carried in a bucket. At that stage, the problem still appeared to be fire, not the full shape of what police would later allege had happened inside. The timeline would not stay simple. Investigators would come to focus on a narrow window between around midnight on Tuesday, the 17th of June 2025, and the afternoon of Thursday, June 19th. They would ask for cameras, dashcam footage, sightings, and any detail that could help place movement in a town where walking mattered more than driving. This article follows the Tamika Chesser and Julian story case, the latest confirmed legal developments, as of July 4, 2026. It is not a verdict. It is a case still moving through the South Australian courts, built around allegations, forensic work, mental health questions, and the difference between public horror and legal proof. The central question is not only what happened in that unit, it is how an ordinary call about smoke became a case about time, movement, remains, evidence, and a courtroom still waiting for answers. The life before the case. Julian's story entered the public record through the worst possible doorway. The documents and official statements that made his name widely known did not start with a full life. They started with an address, an age, a relationship, and a police appeal. He was 39. He lived in Port Lincoln, on South Australia's Eyre Peninsula. Police described him as Tamika Chesser's partner and said the two shared the unit, where emergency services were called on June 19th. A family-supplied photograph later used in case reporting showed him kneeling beside a dog, a small human image against the machinery of a homicide file. That is not enough to contain a life. It never is. Public reporting has not given the full shape of Julian's private world, and that absence should not make him feel less real. It means the available facts have to be handled carefully. A person with family, friends, routines, and a place in a community, now discussed through police statements, court hearings, and forensic language. His family's own words were brief and restrained. They thanked police, emergency services, first responders, family, friends, and the Port Lincoln community. They said they were navigating an unimaginable loss, and that care from others had brought comfort amid chaos. Then they asked for further inquiries to go through police. That statement matters, because it is one of the few public moments where Julian is not just a name inside a charge. It shows a family trying to hold dignity around a case that would quickly become known for its most distressing details. Before the case became a headline, Julian was not evidence. He was a man in a town, in a relationship, in a home, surrounded by ordinary markers of life that the public file can only partly recover. The people around them. Tamika Chesser came into the case with a public past already attached to her name. She had appeared on Beauty and the Geek in 2010, years before the Port Lincoln case, and that fact became part of the public attention almost immediately once a suppression order on her identity was lifted. That television detail is not the case. It explains why the case spread quickly beyond Port Lincoln, but it does not prove anything about what happened. The legal record does not turn on whether Chesser had once been on screen. It turns on what prosecutors can prove about June 2025, what forensic evidence shows, what her defense disputes, and what the court ultimately decides. Police said Chesser had arrived in Port Lincoln relatively recently. They also said she and Julian were in a relationship, and that the domestic relationship was being explored as part of the investigation. At that early stage, police said there was no obvious motive. That absence of a clear motive is important. True crime summaries often rush to create one, because motive gives a story a shape. Courtrooms do not work that way. A prosecution may argue motive if evidence supports it, but motive is not always known, and it is not always legally required in the way the public imagines. The supporting cast was small at first, A neighbor, police, firefighters, emergency services, family members, and a local community asked to search its own cameras and memory. The first public appeal did not ask people to solve the case. It asked them to help map movement. That is where the social world around Julian and Chesser became fragile. In a town where someone walking with dogs could be visible to a camera or a passerby, ordinary movement became potential evidence. The first cracks. The public record does not establish a long, clear lead-up full of warnings. That is one of the case's limits. Police did not announce a settled motive. They did not publicly lay out a detailed history of escalating incidents. They asked for information, and they focused on time. The strongest early pressure point was the gap between when investigators believed Julian was killed and when emergency services were called to the unit. Police said they believed the killing occurred around midnight on Tuesday, June 17th. The fire report came just before 3:30 p.m. on Thursday, June 19th. That gap did not answer the case. It created the case's first frame. If police were right about the timing, then investigators needed to understand what happened across the hours after midnight. Who moved where, what cameras saw, what phones showed, and what could be recovered from the unit. Police also said Chesser did not drive and regularly walked around Port Lincoln. That made pedestrian movement central. A car can cover distance quickly and disappear into traffic. A person walking is more exposed to doorbells, shops, dashcams, neighbors, and chance sightings. This is where a seemingly ordinary detail began to change meaning. Walking was no longer background. It became geography. It became route. It became a question for the town. The first cracks, then, were not dramatic in the way fiction likes. They were practical. A time gap, a local movement pattern, a call for footage, and an investigation that needed the public to help reconstruct what the official record did not yet know. The last ordinary movements. The last ordinary movements in this case are difficult to write because the record is not complete. What can be said is narrower. Police were trying to identify Chesser's movements between around midnight on June 17th and the afternoon of June 19th, and they released images of clothing they said she was wearing during that period. Investigators asked local residents to review CCTV and dashcam footage. That request tells the reader what kind of case this was becoming. It was not only a scene inside a unit. It was a map of streets, paths, cameras, and possible witnesses. Some footage released by police showed a woman they alleged was Chesser walking in Port Lincoln around the relevant period. Later court reporting and police-linked material described images of a woman wearing black clothing, carrying a bag, and walking with dogs after the alleged killing. That did not prove guilt by itself. CCTV can show movement, clothing, an object, or timing. It usually cannot show private thought. It cannot tell a court why a person walked, what they knew, or what was inside a bag, unless other evidence connects those points. But movement can narrow a timeline. A camera can turn a rumor into a record. A bag can become a question. A route can become a search area. At this stage, the case was not yet a complete public narrative. It was a sequence of ordinary-looking details being pulled into a forensic frame. A walk, a unit, a fire call. A town asked to remember what it had seen. The first alarm. The alarm came from the unit, not from a courtroom. Court documents later described emergency services being called to the property on the afternoon of June 19th, after a neighbor reported a fire at Chesser's unit. A witness account in those documents said smoke was seen coming from Unit 3, and that the accused was asked what she was doing. The answer recorded in the document was nothing. The same court document said the witness became concerned the smoke or fire would spread, filled a bucket with water, entered through the rear door, and found smoldering clothing, rags, and debris in the bathroom. The witness doused it, then repeated the action with a second bucket. Only after police were called by firefighters did the case change shape. The document said police entered once the scene was secure and saw deceased remains in the bathroom. Chesser was described in the documents as seated in a garden chair in the rear yard, in a catatonic and unresponsive state. Those details are disturbing, but they must be treated as evidence claims, not spectacle. The importance of the fire is not shock. It is sequence. It helps explain how the case entered official view, why the bathroom became central, and why investigators later needed fire examination, blood pattern analysis, DNA work, phone analysis, and post-mortem material. Chesser was arrested and charged with murder after some of Julian's remains were found at the unit. A suppression order on her identity was lifted on June 27, 2025, allowing her to be publicly identified. The first alarm had begun as smoke. By the time police entered the bathroom, it had become something far larger than a fire. The search for an explanation. The search for an explanation first moved through the official basics. Police said the incident was not random. They said Chesser remained in custody. They said they were investigating her movements and asking the public for CCTV and dashcam footage. They also made one point painfully clear. Not all of Julian's remains had been located. Police said his body had been dismembered and that his head had not been recovered despite searches. Detective Superintendent Darren Fielke said it was crucial to locate it so Julian's family had the opportunity to lay him to rest. The searches covered land and water. State Emergency Service volunteers, police water operations, and local patrols searched reserves, parks, bushland, and ocean areas around Port Lincoln's pier and bay. After an intensive phase, police paused the search while reviewing a significant amount of CCTV footage to decide whether new search areas could be identified. That pause was not the same as giving up. It showed how the case depended on connecting physical geography to digital records. In plain terms, investigators needed to know where to look before throwing more people into scrubland or water. A common misunderstanding in cases like this is that a search is only a matter of effort. The record here shows something more technical. Police were not just searching everywhere. They were trying to make the search smarter by using footage, sightings, routes, and forensic logic. The first explanation had narrowed. This was no longer only about what was inside a unit. It was about what might have left it, where it might have gone, and whether the town itself had recorded part of the answer. The evidence that did not fit. By late July, the search shifted again. Police said a member of the public had found what appeared to be a human skull in scrubland east of Port Lincoln on July 31st. The remains were not on a walking track or in visible sight of one, according to a later court report of police comments. A person had followed a wandering dog into scrub and made the discovery. The location mattered. Detective Superintendent Fielke later said the area had not been searched by police and had not been an area of interest based on the information available at the time. That is a useful corrective to hindsight. Once something is found, it can feel obvious that someone should have looked there. The record says the search geography was being shaped by what police knew then, not what everyone knew later. A day after the discovery, police, a cadaver dog, SES personnel, and local officers searched around the Parnculla Trail area and found several items believed to be connected to the alleged murder. Those items were sent for forensic examination. In September 2025, police said forensic testing confirmed the remains found in scrubland belonged to Julian Story. Forensic Science SA had completed a detailed scientific examination, and police thanked members of the Port Lincoln community for information that had aided the investigation. This was a major development, but not a final answer. Identification can confirm whose remains were found. It does not, by itself, establish every element a court must consider: how death occurred, who was legally responsible, what intent can be proven, what the defense may argue, and whether mental health evidence changes the legal pathway. The evidence had moved the case forward. It had not made the courtroom unnecessary. The event at the center of the case. The central event is still legally alleged, not proven. Prosecutors and police allege that Julian was murdered around midnight on June 17, 2025, and that his body was later dismembered. Police said emergency services discovered his body in the Flinders Highway unit on June 19 after reports of a small fire. Chesser has been charged with murder and with destroying human remains to pervert the course of justice. Later court reporting stated that the two charges would proceed, and that she had not entered pleas after a brief procedural hearing in May 2026. The known sequence has several anchored points. Police believe the alleged killing occurred around midnight on June 17th. Emergency services were called just before 3:30 p.m. on June 19th. A witness account in court documents placed smoke at the unit, a bucket of water, and smoldering material in the bathroom. Police documents said deceased remains were then located in the bathroom, and that Chesser was in the rear yard, in a catatonic and unresponsive state. The prosecution case, as publicly described so far, has not been presented in full at trial. That distinction matters. The public has fragments, a scene, a time window, CCTV, a bag, searches, forensic identification, pending DNA work, phone analysis, fire examination, blood pattern analysis, and a post-mortem report that prosecutors were still awaiting during a December 2025 court hearing. What the evidence cannot prove yet from the open record is just as important. It cannot show the private thoughts inside the unit. It cannot establish motive from public curiosity. It cannot turn distressing circumstances into a verdict. It cannot replace the need for a court to test forensic reports, medical evidence, mental health evidence, and defense arguments. This is why allegation language is not a technicality. It is the difference between describing a criminal charge and declaring a legal outcome that has not happened. When the story broke open, the story widened because of two forces: the extreme nature of the allegations and Chesser's earlier public profile. Once the suppression order was lifted, the case was no longer only a Port Lincoln matter. It became a national true crime story, and then an international one. Police themselves acknowledged the effect of public attention. The South Australian Police Commissioner said a case attracting significant public and media interest could generate more work for police because more people came forward with information. That can help an investigation, but it can also flood it with noise. This is where the public version and the legal version began to separate. The public version focused on the former reality contestant, the missing remains, the dog walker discovery, and the horror of the scene. The legal version moved more slowly. Charge determination, forensic reports, phone analysis, DNA stages, post-mortem timing, and mental health considerations. The reality television detail was searchable, but it was not evidentiary proof. It explained why strangers clicked on the case. It did not explain what happened on June 17th. The case against Chesser must stand or fall on admissible evidence, not on the contrast between a past TV appearance and a criminal allegation. That distinction is one of the reasons this case is difficult to cover responsibly. The most sensational details are easy to remember. The legal safeguards are easier to skip. But in an active case, the safeguards are the story. A charged person remains legally unconvicted unless and until a court finds otherwise. A horrifying allegation is still an allegation until tested in the proper forum. The case could no longer be contained by the original explanation, but the law had not yet delivered its answer. The case built from fragments. By December 2025, the court had heard that the case was complex and that a significant amount of evidence remained outstanding. The material included a post-mortem report, a large volume of DNA evidence, crime scene analysis, fire examination, lighter blood pattern analysis, and analysis of phones belonging to Chesser and Julian. That list shows why the case could not be responsibly reduced to one image. Forensic evidence may help establish identity, contact, sequence, cause, timing, or the condition of a scene. Phone analysis may assist with location, activity, communication, or chronology. Fire examination may help explain what burned, where, and when. DNA may link people, objects, or spaces. But the meaning of each result depends on context. The court also heard that the defense would investigate whether mental health played a role in the alleged offending. Chesser was appearing by video link from James Nash House, a psychiatric facility, and was being held under a mental health detention order. That does not answer the case either. Mental health evidence can matter in several different ways depending on jurisdiction, facts, expert opinion, and legal threshold. It may affect fitness, criminal responsibility, intent, or sentencing if a conviction occurs. It may also be contested. The public should not assume the answer before the court has heard the evidence. The legal question is not whether the facts look disturbing. They plainly do. The legal question is whether prosecutors can prove the charges according to the required standard, while the defense has the opportunity to test the evidence and raise any legally available argument. The fragments are powerful because they are many. They are also incomplete because they still need a court process to give them legal meaning. The court step that did not end the story. The latest confirmed reporting before publication shows the case still active. In May 2026, Chesser appeared by video link for a short procedural hearing after giving birth in custody. Reporting from that hearing said 2 charges, murder and destroying human remains to pervert the course of justice, would proceed, that no plea negotiations had occurred, and that she was due to answer the charges on August 11, 2026. That is not a trial outcome. It is a procedural position. No verdict has been reached. No guilty plea has been entered. No sentence exists. The court has not publicly completed the process of deciding what happened, what can be proven, and what legal responsibility may follow. The earlier December 2025 hearing explains part of the delay. Prosecutors were still waiting on evidence, including DNA and postmortem material, and the case was adjourned because the Director of Public Prosecutions needed the material for charge determination. In plain English, the justice system was still assembling the file. That matters because serious criminal cases are not supposed to move only at the speed of public emotion. They move through evidence, disclosure, expert reports, charge decisions, mental health assessments, and court timetables. For Julian's family and community, that slow pace can feel like another burden. For the legal process, it is the structure that separates accusation from adjudication. The story, then, has not reached closure. It has reached a waiting point, charges proceeding, evidence still carrying weight, and a court date ahead. The aftermath, people still argue about. The aftermath began before the legal outcome, because the case's public meaning arrived early. Port Lincoln had been asked to assist a search connected to a deeply distressing allegation. Emergency workers, SES volunteers, police, and residents were drawn into the effort to locate remains and identify evidence. Julian's family prepared for a funeral after the later discovery and identification of remains. Police said further items located near the Parnkala Trail were sent for forensic examination, and by September 2025, the remains found in Scrubland had been confirmed as Julian's. The case also created a media problem. The details that attract clicks are not always the details that determine guilt. The public remembers the missing head, the walking trail, the fire, the former TV contestant, and the dog walker discovery. The court must work with evidence categories: medical, forensic, digital, witness, scene, and mental health. That difference is not pedantry. It is the whole safeguard. A true crime audience can discuss a case endlessly. A court must decide only what has been properly put before it. Another point remains uncomfortable. Julian's public identity is thinner than Chesser's because she had a public past. That imbalance can distort attention. It can make the accused person more visually memorable than the man whose life is at the center of the case. A responsible account has to resist that pull. Chesser's past explains the scale of attention. Julian's life explains the weight of the case. The review, appeal, or unanswered question. There is no appeal yet, because there is no verdict to appeal. The unresolved question is earlier and more fundamental. How will the court treat the evidence once the prosecution and defense positions are fully developed? Several strands remain central. The postmortem report matters, because cause and medical findings can affect legal causation and reconstruction. DNA matters because it can link people, objects, or locations, but it must be interpreted carefully. Phone analysis matters because it may support or challenge movement, timing, or contact. Fire and pattern analysis matter because the scene itself was altered by burning and emergency response. The mental health question also remains significant. Defense counsel told the court that Chesser was expected to remain at James Nash House for some time, and that the defense would investigate whether mental health played a role in the alleged offending. That is not an answer. It is a sign of one legal route the case may have to examine. The open record also leaves motive unresolved. Police said early on that there was no obvious motive. That is not the same as saying there was none. It means the public record had not established one, and the court had not decided one. The uncomfortable lesson is that the details people most remember are not always the details that can answer the legal question. The case still depends on what forensic science, witness evidence, digital records, medical findings, and mental health evidence can prove. Until then, the unanswered question remains disciplined rather than dramatic. What will survive testing in court? Why this case still matters. The Tamika Chesser and Julian story case matters because it sits at the collision point between public horror and legal restraint. It is easy to turn the case into a handful of sensational images: a unit, a fire, a walking trail, a bag, a former reality contestant, a dog in scrubland. Those images are part of the case, but they are not the whole case. The whole case is slower, more technical, and more legally fragile. It matters because Julian's story can disappear behind the details of what allegedly happened to him. The family statement, the community support, and the need to lay him to rest are reminders that he was not a symbol in someone else's downfall. He was the person whose life anchors every court date and every forensic report. It matters because Chesser remains accused, not convicted. That distinction protects the integrity of the process, even in a case where the alleged facts are deeply distressing. If the court eventually reaches a verdict, that verdict will have meaning because the evidence has been tested, not because the public already felt certain. And it matters because the first visible sign was so small. Smoke, a unit, a neighbor worried about a fire spreading. By the end, that smoke had become a map of movement, a search through land and water, a discovery off a walking trail, a forensic file, and a court process still waiting to answer what happened inside the silence between Tuesday midnight and Thursday afternoon.